I was born in Scarborough, Ontario, just north of Toronto. Then when my mom was single when I was born, and then she married someone when I was about 9 years of age. I was looked after by foster parents while she worked 2 jobs and would see her on the weekends, which was always a party time. And then when I came around 14, it was really shaky time because I had different feelings in my body that I didn't understand totally, but I knew I was different than some other people. And so I told my mom I had feelings for men, guys around the school and stuff. And she said, "Oh, that's an illness." And I went, "What?" And so she went to a psychiatrist and said it was an illness and went through shock treatments. And basically that went on for 6 months and I couldn't take any more of it. They would do a shock treatment and then an analyzing of you, and you would have to look at pictures and stuff, and they'd say, "What does this picture mean? What does this picture mean?" And after a shock treatment, you just had to say the right questions or else you feel like you're getting another shock treatment. So they thought homosexuality was an illness when I first came out at 14 in the 70s in Toronto. And it was really hard. I said, "Mom, I can't go back anymore." And she said, "You'll do as I tell you." And I said, "I can't."
Okay, so my dad was in the military, which meant I moved around a lot. About every 2 years I lived in a different home. And started off in Nova Scotia, lived in the Maritimes for 10 years, then lived in Ontario for 5, and got sent to Calgary, Alberta when I was 15, which was like a bit of a sentence. So as far as architecture goes, my mother once asked me when I was 7 or 8 years old what I wanted to do when I grow up. And I gave her the answers I thought I was supposed to, which is policeman, fireman, ballerina. And she said to me, "Well, what about architecture? I've noticed that you're always looking at houses when we go around." And that was like a light got turned on in my head on architecture. And from that moment on, I was zeroed in, focused on architectural design and buildings and urban design and stuff like that. I started drafting as a kid with pen and paper at first, and then a drafting board. And all of my artistic endeavors or creative endeavors were consumed and occupied by architectural design as a kid and a teenager. In that same period, my other focus in life was competitive swimming. My dad's job in the armed forces was a physical fitness instructor for the Navy, which meant that as kids of a physical fitness instructor, we had to get involved somehow in sports. And my oldest brother, with 3 boys and a girl, my oldest brother was the jock, like my dad, who could do everything and any sport and all sports. The middle brother was kind of a geek and wouldn't have anything to do with sports. So when I came along, I kind of felt obliged to participate. But I was way too small for team sports because I'm little now. I was really little as a kid, so I didn't want to get clobbered. I hated the cold, so hockey wasn't going to work and all this stuff. So I found swimming, and that kind of satisfied my dad's need for another athlete in the family, and gave me I think throughout life, the long-term characteristics of hardworking and discipline and focus on and an eye on a goal kind of characteristics that has served me well throughout life.
I was born in England in 1959, and I had brother and sister. I grew up in a family where my father was a teacher and my mother stayed at home. We had a pretty good life. I had really enjoyable school years, and my mum and dad unfortunately broke up when I was 17 years old, and I ended up leaving with my mother to Canada because my mother was born in Canada. And so I came back to Canada, or she came back to Canada and I went with her. And I always knew from the time I was a child it's where I wanted to be anyway after a vacation here. And so when I came to Canada, it was 1980, and I landed in Calgary, and then I went to Mississauga, and after that to Vancouver, and stayed in BC after that. So I was here in BC from 1986. Just got in time for Expo to see Prince Charles and Lady Diana going past our accounting firm, waving to them in their car. I guess I've always been sports-minded, so I enjoyed field hockey. And I've always loved animals. I've been an animal lover all my life, so I used to have a couple of different dogs. We had lots of pets at home. I had about 20 goldfish, an owl, a poodle, and then I had a Jack Russell, and 3 tortoises. They were called Thomas the First, Thomas the Second, and Thomas the Third. And that was, maybe a rabbit or 2, and we had hedgehogs in the yard. So we had lots of animals. I've always loved animals. And books, I love reading books. Swimming, I used to enjoy diving. Reading, I guess. Like I said, lots of books at home. Apart from that, I used to just like going to Europe because my dad used to take trips to Europe, and so I was always going over to Europe in my summer holidays. And I went horse riding a lot. In our phys ed lessons in England, we could choose between going for driving lessons and going horse riding, and I couldn't afford either a horse or a car, so I thought I'd go horse riding.
I was born in Vancouver when it was a small town. It had about 400,000 people in it, so it's grown a little bit since then. My father had an electrical contracting firm, so we were in the business of wiring apartments, and I remember that as a teenager I would go out on the job pulling wires through many of the so-called high-rises of the West End. I became interested in the city at an early age, and I do have one memory that sort of predates all of this. Before they built the Granville Street Bridge, the one that's currently there was an old railroad trestle of a bridge that crossed the creek in its stead. And I was probably 4 or 5, because it had to have happened before the 1950s, and I was born in 44, so it was 1948, 49 when this short conversation took place, and I was sitting in the front seat of the car, and my dad was driving. And my father is sort of looking out at Falls Creek, which had just been termed an industrial slum by the mayor of Vancouver of that day. And he looked at me, the 4-year-old, and he said, "Someday this is going to be worth a lot of money. Do you think we should buy this?" So the 4-year-old looked over at him and said, "Yeah."
I was born and raised in northern Quebec, Company Town. There's a large aluminum smelter there where my father worked. And I was an Anglo in the deep heart of Francophone Quebec, so I grew up bilingual. It was the most natural thing in the world that I spoke English at home, at church, and in school, but when I went to the corner store, it was completely en français. I had some wonderful jobs that I only wished were full-time with a decent wage. For example, I worked at King's Landing Historical Settlement, Living History Museum. Fascinating. I worked in a sawmill with a 30-foot overshot water wheel driving the works. All the gears were wooden. The only piece of metal in the entire sawmill was the saw itself. I worked in a flour mill, stone grinding, buckwheat. I worked in a print shop, which was all letterpress. Set up the letters, mirror image upside down and backwards, and then locked them into a frame and put them in a platen press, which is like a clamshell. Watch your fingers, shuttle operated.
I was actually born in Hamilton. Not many people know that. But never actually lived in Hamilton. When I was an infant, my family moved to Fergus, which is a beautiful small town on the banks of the Grand River in southern Ontario, just 6 miles north of Guelph, sandwiched between Guelph and Elora, a beautiful part of southern Ontario. So that's where I spent my first 6 years, in an idyllic little town in the early 60s, when children were able to roam free without constraints. My mother only said, "Don't go down to the river, Moffy." And of course, where did I end up going all the time? Down to the river. So it was when I was aged 6 we moved to the sterile suburbs of Metro Toronto, and that was a bit of a shock, because moving from the idyllic banks of the Grand River to the endless ticky-tack suburban non-stop recently plowed over farm fields to make room for the burgeoning Toronto suburbs was quite a shock for a little boy. So that's Willowdale. Don't have many fond memories of Willowdale, actually. It was a very repressive environment. I was the tail end Charlie of 4 kids, so by the time I was growing up, my siblings had found their own niche in life, and I felt rather isolated and abandoned in the household, and in the nothingness of the suburbs was rather a barren, lonely childhood existence.
Well, I was born and raised in Vancouver, actually born at home in the house I grew up in. Yeah, I had a fairly normal childhood. Kind of figured out pretty early on that I was different, in the sense that I didn't quite fit in a lot of different places, and that started to make sense a little bit later on in life. But you know, in the beginning, it was a little interesting. I kind of knew instinctively to keep certain things under taps. So it made things a little interesting. I mean, as I was growing up, I really much preferred dolls and jump rope and all of those things, and boys' games really didn't appeal to me very much. So I tended to be a little bit of a target when I was younger. Kind of grew out of that eventually, but it was interesting. So I didn't really have a great time in school until I started to get into the higher grades and started to find out other activities that more suited my needs. My early life was a little complicated, but you know, again, you know, I grew up when the city was a lot smaller than it is now, and a lot quieter and a lot more small town feeling. You know, when people talk about, you know, leaving their doors unlocked and whatnot, Vancouver was like that. So it's been kind of interesting watching the process of the city develop and get as big as it is.
When I was in my late teens, I was hanging out with this cool artist named Marianne Moyers, and we were over at her place and drinking some wine and going through a box of old magazines she'd found in the alley, old, you know, Canadian home living magazines and stuff from the 50s and 60s, and we were going through them, having a good time, and I kept running across the same piece of clip art, you know, the drawing of the chevron man or the milkman or the postman, and I was referring to it as the average Joe, and we ran across one again, and I flipped the words and I said Joe Average, and we looked at each other and we started laughing, and she went, "Oh my God," and I went, "Oh my God, that's my name," and I started signing Joe Average on everything.